The lecture hall's morning air on the university campus carried with it a restless kind of energy. Students hurried across the wide pathways, their backpacks heavy with books, their minds already tense with the thought of midterms. Sundar walked. Slowly, almost as if he did not belong to the same pace as everyone else. He held his notebooks close, his face calm, but behind his glasses, his eyes carried something deeper, an endless hunger to learn, mixed with the quiet fear of being noticed. In those days, Sundar was just another young man far away from home. His accent strong, his pockets almost empty, and his confidence tested by the sharp edges of a New World dot inside mathematics building. The sound of chalk scratching against a blackboard echoed faintly even before class began. Professor Henry, known among students as a brilliant but ruthless liberal academic, was already there, drawing strange curves across the board with long, confident strokes. He had a reputation that followed him like a shadow. He was not just tough, he was humiliating. If he thought a student unworthy of being in his class, he made sure the entire lecture hall knew. Many feared him, some admired him, but almost none escaped his piercing questions without embarrassment as Sundar entered the hall and sat near the middle row. He could feel the tension. Whispers filled the room. Some students leaned close to their friends, muttering about the professor's mood. Others flipped nervously through their textbooks, hoping not to be called today. Sundar quietly opened his notebook and placed his pen on top. He had studied late into the night, revisiting calculus problems again and again, until his tired eyes refused to see numbers clearly. He knew he could solve them, but he also knew that confidence did not always protect you when someone tried to break your spirit. The lecture began in silence. Professor Henry's deep voice carried authority as he explained advanced limits and integrals, his chalk tapping the board in rhythm. The first 10 minutes were steady, but then his eyes searched the hall. He loved this moment, choosing a target, watching the class hold its breath, waiting to see who would be placed under fire. Today, his gaze landed on Sundar. "You, the professor said, pointing the chalk toward him. "What's your name?" Sundar straightened, his heart beating fast, though his voice stayed soft. "Sundar," he said. The professor smirked. "Sundar? Well, Sundar, why don't you show us if you deserve that seat?" "Come down to the board." A wave of murmurs spread across the hall. Sundar stood, adjusting his glasses, and walked down the aisle. Every step echoed like a drumbeat in his ears. When he reached the board, the professor handed him the chalk. "Solve this." Professor Henry commanded, writing an expression filled with layers of complexity. Nested functions, derivatives, and an integral that stretched across half the blackboard. The kind of problem that left even confident students frozen. Sundar stared at it. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. His mind raced. He remembered the nights of studying by dim light, the sacrifices his parents made to send him here, the quiet words his mother had whispered before he left home. Stay humble, but never let anyone tell you that you are less than them. Those words became an anchor now. He took the chalk in his hand, and instead of rushing, he paused. Silence filled the room. The professor crossed his arms, waiting for Sundar to stumble. A few students smiled nervously, some almost hoping he would fail. It was easier to laugh at someone else's pain than to face your own fear of being called next dot. Then Sundar began. His handwriting was small but steady. He broke the problem into steps, whispering softly as he wrote, not for the class, not for the professor, but for himself to stay calm, to stay focused. Every line of work he wrote seemed to cut through the problem with surprising clarity. He transformed the intimidating equation into smaller parts. Each step, a thread pulling the mess into order. Whispers turned into silence. Students leaned forward, watching as Sundar's method unfolded. He was not fast, but he was precise, and each move revealed not just knowledge, but patience. After several minutes, the board was filled with neat lines of reasoning, until finally he circled the answer. Sundar lowered the chalk, turned around, and met the professor's gaze. The professor's smirk faded. He had expected hesitation, maybe. A mistake he could pounce on. Instead, he saw a calmness in Sundar's eyes, a quiet defiance that needed no arrogance. Interesting, Professor Henry said slowly. You've managed to solve it. His tone was not congratulatory. It was sharp, as though admitting defeat. But he was not finished. He walked towards Sundar, lowering his voice so the hall leaned closer to hear. But solving one problem doesn't mean you understand the subject. Anyone can memorize. Tell me, Sundar, why does this method work? Explain it without the formulas. This was not just about math anymore. It was a challenge to his intelligence, his accent, his ability to speak with clarity. Sundar swallowed, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. He began to explain. His words were simple, his accent thick, but his reasoning clear. He spoke of how the function behaved, how limits guided the process, how the integral was not just numbers, but a story of change. And as he spoke, something shifted in the room. Students who had once whispered now listened intently. They could feel the sincerity in his words, the humility in his voice. The professor frowned, tapping his fingers against the desk. His attempt to humiliate Sundar had turned into an unexpected lesson, just as the room began to respect Sundar's. Answer, the professor cut in sharply. Enough, he said, his voice echoing across the hall. Sit down. This class is not about storytelling. It's about rigor. Sundar nodded quietly, handed back the chalk, and walked back to his seat. But the eyes of the students followed him differently now. He was no longer invisible yet, as Sundar sat down. He noticed one student in the back corner staring at him with a strange intensity. Scribbling something quickly into a notebook, Sundar felt a chill, though he did not understand. Why the lecture moved on? But Sundar's mind could not shake the feeling that today was not just about a math problem. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would test not only his knowledge, but his resilience, his humility, and his strength to stand tall in a world that often tried to push him down. And as the bell rang and students packed, Professor Henry stopped Sundar at the door. See me in my office, he said firmly. The class gasped. No one ever wanted that invitation. Sundar froze, his heart pounding once again. He could not know it then, but what waited for him? That office would change everything. Asterisk the professor's effusive hallway outside. The lecture hall was unusually quiet after class ended. Students rushed away with laughter and conversations, but Sundar walked slowly, each step heavy, as if his shoes carried the weight of stones. The echo of the professor's voice, "See me in my office," played again and again in his head. He had heard stories from others. Being summoned by Professor Henry was not a reward. It was usually the beginning of humiliation behind closed doors. Students came out of that office shaken, some even questioning their choice of pursuing mathematics at all. Sundar had no idea what awaited him, but his chest felt tight, his palms damp with sweat. The office door loomed at the end of the corridor, tall, dark, and marked with the professor's nameplate that glinted under the fluorescent light. Sundar paused for a moment, adjusting his glasses, gathering courage from the memory of his mother's words. Then, with a quiet knock, he stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and old books. Shelves towered to the ceiling, crammed, with volumes of mathematics, philosophy, and politics. The professor sat behind a large desk, papers scattered like battle plans across its surface. His sharp eyes rose immediately to meet Sundar's. There was no smile, no kindness, only the expression of a man who enjoyed testing the limits of those before him. Sit. The professor ordered, his voice flat. Sundar obeyed, perching nervously on the edge of the wooden chair for a long moment. The professor said nothing, simply studied him like an insect under a magnifying glass. Sundar felt his throat dry. Finally, the professor leaned back and spoke. You did well today, he said. Better than most expected. But don't mistake that for brilliance. One problem solved in front of a class does not make you special. Sundar nodded slowly, unsure whether he was supposed to respond. The professor continued. I see this too often. Students from faraway places, arriving here with their big dreams, thinking hard work alone will carry them through. But this world doesn't reward just hard work, Sundar. It rewards sharpness, presence, authority. Do you think you have that? The question hung in the air like a trap. Sundar looked down at his notebook in his hands. He could feel the challenge inside it, a hidden dare to either defend himself or surrender. After a pause, he lifted his gaze. I don't know if I have authority, he said quietly, but I believe in learning. I believe if I work hard enough, I can find answers. The professor's lips curled into a thin smile, almost mocking. So naive, he said. Answers alone won't save you. I can make you look like a fool any day of the week, Sundar. Your accent, your hesitations, your simple way of speaking, they make you vulnerable. And in this country, vulnerability is weakness. Sundar's chest tightened, but he stayed silent. The professor stood up and walked toward the chalkboard fixed on the wall of his office. He quickly scribbled another dense equation, then turned back. Prove yourself again, he said. If you fail here, no one will know. But I will. And I'll decide whether you belong in this program. Sundar's fingers trembled slightly as he rose. He approached the board, staring at the new problem. It was harder than the last, with hidden complexities meant to confuse. The professor folded his arms, watching with cold amusement. Sundar took a breath and closed his eyes for a moment. Instead of rushing, he remembered the lessons of his childhood solving puzzles on scraps of paper because new books were too expensive. Practicing problems again and again until the logic behind them felt like second nature. He remembered his father's quiet sacrifice, working long hours so his son could study, and his mother's prayers whispered under her breath when she thought he wasn't listening, with those memories as strength. Sundar began to write. Movements were slow at first, then steady, his reasoning building step by step. But halfway through, the problem twisted unexpectedly. He froze, the chalk still in his hand. His heart thudded loudly in his ears. The professor smirked. There it is, the professor said. The limit of your knowledge? You've reached it sooner than I expected. Students had described this tone before, the moment the professor smelled weakness. He struck hard. Sundar felt the pressure building, the temptation to give up heavy in his chest. But instead of panicking, he stepped back, stared at the board, and whispered softly to himself. He retraced his steps, line by line, searching for a mistake. Then suddenly his eyes widened. He had seen it, the hidden path forward, with new energy. He returned to the chalkboard, corrected his work, and pressed on. Minutes stretched, the silence in the office broken only by the faint scratching of chalk. Finally, after a long struggle, the answer emerged, neat and complete. Sundar set the chalk down and stepped back. The professor's eyes narrowed. There was no praise, no recognition of the determination Sundar had shown. Instead, he leaned closer and said in a low voice, You may have solved it, but you'll never command respect here. Not with that quiet humility. People will walk over you. I will walk over you. Do you understand? The words cut deeper than the problem had. Sundar felt his chest ache, but he did not let his face show pain. He simply nodded. Professor Henry waved his hand dismissively. Go, he said. And remember this, if you want to survive in my class, you'll need more than correct answers. You'll need to prove you're tougher than everyone else. Otherwise, you'll fail, no matter how many equations you solve. Sundar left the office quietly, but inside, his thoughts were storming. He walked back across the campus as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with fading light. His heart was heavy, but beneath that weight, something was forming, an unshakable resolve. He would not change who he was to please the professor. He would not trade humility for arrogance or kindness for cruelty. He would prove that respect could be earned without humiliation. That strength could exist in gentleness. Yet as he crossed the courtyard, Sundar once again felt that strange sensation of being watched. He turned his head and noticed the same student from earlier, the one scribbling notes in the lecture hall, standing under a tree, staring at him with an unreadable expression. Before Sundar could say anything, the student slipped the notebook under his arm and walked away quickly, disappearing into the crowd. Sundar stood frozen for a moment, unease twisting in his chest. Who was that student? And why did he seem so intent on observing everything? The night would bring no answers, only restless thoughts. And as Sundar finally lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, he had no idea that this mysterious observer was about to play a role in his life that he could never have imagined. Asterisk, the whisper of betrayal following morning, the campus seemed brighter. But Sundar felt no warmth in its light. He had barely slept through the night, his mind caught between the professor's sharp words and the haunting image of the student who had watched him so intently. Questions gnawed at him. Why had the boy been scribbling so furiously in that notebook? Why had he followed with those piercing eyes? And why did it feel as though Sundar's every step was being recorded for a reason he could not yet understand? When he entered the lecture hall again, the usual chatter of students filled the air, but there was also a faint undercurrent of curiosity. Whispers floated from row to row, and Sundar caught fragments, his name, the word office, and laughter that stung, though he could not hear the full sentences. News had already spread. Students seemed to know he had been called into the professor's office after class, though none knew exactly what had happened inside. That secrecy only made the speculation louder. Professor Henry walked in with the same sternness, his presence commanding the room into silence without effort. He began his lecture briskly, moving through dense material with precision. But midway through, he stopped, set down his chalk, and turned his gaze directly towards Sundar once again. "Mr. Sundar," he said, his voice echoing across the room, "since you appear to enjoy solving problems, let's give the class some entertainment." The words struck Sundar like cold steel. Entertainment. This was not about learning. It was about humiliation dressed as education. The professor wrote another intricate problem on the board, more complicated than the last two combined. Then, with a flourish, he turned to the class. "Can anyone solve this?" Silence. No one dared raise their hand. The problem was designed to terrify. "Then Sundar," the professor said, gesturing to him, "the stage is yours." A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Sundar rose slowly, feeling the weight of countless eyes. Some were eager to see him fail, others curious to see if he could survive again. But all of them were watching. He walked to the board, picked up the chalk, and studied the equation. His first instinct was pure complex, layered with traps. But then he remembered the night he had spent working under dim light, pushing through fatigue, whispering to himself that understanding would eventually come if he stayed patient. He forced his breathing to steady and began writing. However, the pressure felt different. Each stroke of chalk seemed louder, every pause heavier. Behind him, he could hear faint giggles, sharp whispers, the restless shuffling of feet. His body tightened. He could not let the professor break him, but he also could not let the eyes of his peers reduce him to silence. Slowly, step by step, he built his argument. Mistakes came, but he erased them gently, corrected them, moved on. At one point he froze, his mind blank, but then a memory of his father's voice came back to him. Never give up halfway, even if the road seems endless. He pressed forward, drawing from that memory the courage to continue. After what felt like an eternity, the solution stood completed. Sundar turned, chalk still in hand, his breathing heavy but controlled. The room fell silent. Even the whispers stopped. The answer was correct. Anyone who knew enough could see that. Sundar had once again solved what was meant to be unsolvable. But Professor Henry's face hardened. Instead of admiration, there was irritation, as though Sundar's success had somehow insulted him. "Interesting," the professor said coldly. But mathematics is not simply about reaching the right answer. It is about elegance, about command. He took far too long. A true mathematician would never waste so much time stumbling around the problem. His words cut through. The brief silence, shattering the fragile moment of respect Sundar had earned. The professor turned back to the class. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Solving problems is not enough. If you cannot do it with confidence, with authority, then your success means nothing. A few students laughed softly, nodding, echoing his sentiment. Others remained quiet, their eyes betraying doubt. Sundar walked back to his seat, his chest heavy, but his face calm. He had expected no applause, but the sting of deliberate dismissal still hurt not yet as he sat down. Something caught his attention again. The same mysterious student in the back row was writing furiously in his notebook, his head bent low, his eyes flickering occasionally towards Sundar. Later, after class ended, Sundar left quickly, hoping to avoid questions. But halfway across the courtyard, footsteps hurried behind him. "You think you're clever, don't you?" a voice sneered. Sundar turned to see two classmates standing close, their expressions unfriendly. "The professor doesn't like show-offs. You should be careful. People who try to outshine him usually don't last long here." Sundar said nothing, simply adjusted his glasses and kept walking. But their laughter followed him, sharp and cruel, until it blended with the wind when he finally reached the library to escape. He sat at a corner table, opened his books, and tried to bury himself in formulas. But then he felt it again, that presence. When he looked up, the mysterious student was standing across the room, staring at him without a smile. The boy finally walked over and placed his notebook on the table. "You should see this," he said softly. Then he walked away without another. Sundar hesitated, staring at the closed notebook left behind. His hand hovered over it, his chest pounding with both fear and curiosity. What could it possibly contain? With a trembling hand, he opened the cover, and what he saw written inside left him frozen, his breath caught in his throat. Asterisk. The notebook of Shadow's library was silent, except for the faint rustle of pages turning and the occasional creak of chairs as students shifted in their seats. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the wooden floor. Sundar sat still in the corner, his hand resting on the notebook that the mysterious student had left behind. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, as though opening it would alter his path forever. His heart thudded heavily in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was crossing into something unknown. Finally, with a slow breath, he flipped the cover. The first few pages were filled with dense handwriting, sharp and hurried, as though the words had been written in secret. Sundar leaned closer. His eyes widened. The notes were about him. Every detail of the past 2 days was written in chilling precision. The exact questions the professor had asked, the way Sundar had solved them. The expressions on his face, even the tremble in his hands when he paused midway. The handwriting captured moments Sundar himself had barely noticed. But it wasn't just observation. Beneath each account were the students' interpretations, filled with biting comments. "He lacks confidence. Too slow to be impressive. The professor will use this against him. He doesn't belong here." Sundar's stomach tightened. His throat felt dry. It was as if someone had stripped him bare, turned his struggle into fuel for mockery. He flipped further through. The notebook. There were sketches of the classroom, little caricatures of Sundar at the blackboard, exaggerated to make him look awkward and weak. Under one sketch, the student had written, "Foreigners think hard work is enough. They don't realize this system will crush them." Sundar's hand trembled as he shut the notebook. The silence of the library pressed in around him, suffocating. He looked up, searching the rows of shelves. But the mysterious student was gone. For a long time, Sundar sat frozen, the weight of betrayal heavy on his chest. Why would someone spend so much energy documenting his every move? Was it simple cruelty or something more dangerous? That evening, when Sundar returned to his small room, he tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on his studies. But the words from the notebook echoed in his mind. He doesn't belong here. It was as though they were carved into the walls around him. The next day in class, Sundar entered quietly, keeping his eyes low. But when he looked up, he saw several students glancing at him with half smiles, whispers sliding across the room. The notebook. Somehow, its contents had spread. Professor Henry strode into the room as usual, his sharp presence silencing the chatter. Yet even he seemed to be aware of the growing whispers. Halfway through his lecture, he stopped, his eyes glinting. "Mr. Sundar," he said, his voice heavy with amusement. "It seems your reputation is growing." A ripple of laughter spread through the class. Sundar's chest tightened. The professor's words were deliberate. He knew of the ridicule. "Tell me." The professor continued, "Do you think persistence can make up for weakness? Do you believe the world will admire you simply because you don't give up?" Sundar rose slowly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. His voice was quiet but steady. "I don't know what the world will admire," he said. "But I know that giving up would dishonor the sacrifices that brought me here." For a moment, silence followed his words. Then the professor smirked. "We shall see." He turned back to the board and scribbled another daunting problem. This time more twisted, more carefully constructed to trap. "Solve this," he commanded, motioning toward Sundar. Sundar's legs felt heavy as he walked to the front. Once. Again, eyes bored into him, some mocking, some curious, and one set of eyes in particular burning with strange satisfaction. The mysterious student sat at the back, notebook in hand, scribbling furiously again. This time, as Sundar stared at the problem, his mind felt clouded. The laughter, the whispers, the notebook's cruel words, they crowded in, pushing against his focus. He wrote a line, erased it, wrote another, then stopped again. Sweat beaded on his forehead. A chuckle broke from somewhere in the room. Another followed. The professor folded his arms, saying nothing, waiting for Sundar to collapse. Under the weight of silence, but then, deep inside, Sundar heard another voice. Not the professor's, not the student's, not the cruel words from the notebook. It was his mother's voice, soft and steady. "Stay humble, but never let anyone tell you that you are less." He closed his eyes briefly, letting the words settle. When he opened them, his hand moved with new steadiness. Line by line, he untangled the problem, stripping away its traps, cutting through the confusion. Minutes stretched, but Sundar persisted. When the final solution appeared on the board, neat and undeniable, the room fell silent. The professor's expression was unreadable. The students shifted uneasily. Even the mysterious one at the back stopped writing for a moment. But before Sundar could breathe relief, the professor turned, his voice sharp as a blade. "Congratulations, Sundar. You've proved that persistence can occasionally overcome incompetence." Laughter broke out again. Some students slapped their desks. Others whispered cruelly. Sundar stood still, his body rigid, his heart pounding. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, but he remained silent. Humility held him still. He returned to his seat, but as he did, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The mysterious student's notebook open on his desk now contained not only sketches of Sundar, but words written in bold, dark ink. "The professor will destroy him. I will make sure of it." Sundar sat down, his hands cold. This was no simple observation anymore. It was a plan. Asterisk. The breaking point. Days that followed felt heavier than any Sundar had ever lived through. The notebook's words, "the professor will destroy him, I will make sure of it," echoed in his mind at every step, like shadows that refused to leave. He wanted to believe he was imagining things, that maybe the mysterious student was only venting frustration in private scribbles. But the way the whispers around campus grew louder each day told him otherwise. It wasn't just the professor's cruelty anymore. It was the silent laughter of peers, the way they looked at him when he entered a room, the way conversations paused when he walked past. The mysterious student had begun to spread his writings. Sundar knew it. Fragments of his private struggles were twisted into cruel jokes. Students repeated his pauses at the board, imitating his accent, mocking the way his hand shook when he held the chalk. Each mockery was a wound. Still, Sundar tried to keep his head down, focusing on books, drowning in problems and numbers as if logic could shield him from pain. But even the clarity of mathematics could not silence the ache of humiliation. Professor Henry, too, seemed to enjoy turning the class into a stage for Sundar's suffering. Almost every lecture now included a moment where he singled Sundar out, pulling him to the board, giving him problems designed not just to test knowledge, but to drag out the process of his struggle. He did not allow him to explain his reasoning, cutting him off before he could finish, declaring to the class that Sundar was slow, that he lacked the sharpness needed to succeed. Every time laughter followed, and every time Sundar forced himself to stand still, to breathe, to remind himself of the voice of his parents. Do not fight fire with fire. Let your actions speak louder. Yet the hardest moment came one Friday afternoon, when the lecture hall was more crowded than usual. Whispers had spread that the professor was preparing something. Even students who were not in the class had slipped into the back rows, eager to witness whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Sundar felt it the moment he walked in. The room was alive with cruel anticipation. Professor Henry entered with a thin smile, something rare for him. He placed his books on the desk and looked around. "Today," he announced, "we will have a little test of knowledge. And what better way to test than through competition?" He wrote 2 large problems on the board, both equally dense, both carefully constructed to twist logic in unexpected directions. Then he turned to the class. 2 students will come forward and solve these problems side by side. We will see not only who solves it correctly, but who commands the board with speed and confidence. The room buzzed with excitement. Then the professor's eyes scanned the rows, and everyone already knew whom he would choose. "Sundar," he said, his voice cutting like a knife, and his eyes flicked toward the back row. "Michael." The mysterious student rose slowly, notebook in hand, his lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. So his name was Michael. Sundar felt his body stiffen. The stage had been set, and it was no accident. This was Michael's plan, woven with the professor's delight. They walked to the front, standing side by side. The board loomed before them, chalk in hand. The professor raised his voice. "Begin." The race began in silence. Chalk struck the board. Equations unfolded line by line. Michael moved fast, his strokes wide and confident, almost theatrical. He glanced back at the audience occasionally, feeding off their attention. Whispers of approval rose from the crowd. Sundar, meanwhile, moved slower, more deliberate, pausing to think before each step. His lines were neat, his reasoning precise, but his pace could not match Michael's showmanship. "Look at him," someone whispered. "He's too slow." Another chuckled. "He'll never catch up." The words reached Sundar's ears, but he forced them aside. He remembered his father's advice from years ago. Speed impresses people, but accuracy changes the world. He held onto that truth, refusing to let go. Minutes passed, and Michael was the first to finish. He dropped his chalk dramatically, stepping aside as though claiming victory. Cheers and applause rippled across the hall. Professor Henry clapped his hands lightly. "See? This is what command looks like. Sharpness, presence, the ability to not waste time." All eyes turned to Sundar, still working on the last steps. His body felt the pressure like a weight pressing against his back, but he refused to rush. With steady determination, he finished the final calculation, circled his answer, and stepped aside. The professor glanced at both solutions. Michael's was bold, flashy, but flawed errors hidden in his speed, logic sacrificed for show. Sundar's, on the other hand, was exact, clean, undeniable. For a moment, the truth hung in the air, visible to anyone with knowledge. But Professor Henry's voice cut through it before respect could form. "Well," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Michael showed confidence. Sundar showed hesitation. In the real world, confidence wins. Laughter exploded across the hall. Michael smiled smugly, bowing slightly as though acknowledging victory. Sundar stood frozen, his face calm, but his heart breaking. He had done the work. He had found the truth. And still, truth was dismissed because it did not shine loudly enough. As the class ended, Sundar walked out alone, the laughter trailing behind him like a cruel echo. The courtyard seemed emptier than ever, the world colder. He sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, staring at his hands. For the first time, doubt crept in deeply. Maybe they are right. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe humility is weakness. His thoughts spiraled darker, but then something shifted. As the wind rustled the branches above, he remembered his mother's voice again, softer this time, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Stay humble, but never let anyone tell you that you are less. Tears blurred his eyes, but within the tears, a new fire was lit. He realized then that his journey was not about the professor, not about Michael, not even about the classmates who laughed. It was about proving, if not to them, then to himself, that respect born of resilience was stronger than applause born of arrogance thought as Sundar rose from the bench. His chest still heavy, but his step steadier. He did not know that the next confrontation would not only test his resolve, but reveal truths that would shake the entire classroom and change his path forever. Asterisk, the reckoning. The morning of the final lecture arrived with a tension that seemed to hang over the campus like storm clouds. Sundar walked slowly across the courtyard, his books pressed tightly to his chest. Though his steps were steady, his heart carried the weight of weeks of ridicule, whispers, and public trials. He had endured the professor's cutting remarks, the laughter of classmates, and Michael's cruel notes. But he had also found something. Within himself, a quiet strength, a flame that no humiliation could extinguish. As he entered the lecture hall, he noticed at once that the atmosphere was different. The room was more crowded than usual, with students from other classes filling the aisles and standing along the walls. Word had spread that today the professor planned something extraordinary. Sundar could feel the sharp edge of anticipation in the air, as though everyone had come to witness a final blow. Professor Henry entered, his eyes glinting with confidence. He placed a thick stack of papers on the desk, then turned to the board with deliberate slowness. Today, he announced, we end this series with a challenge. The kind of problem that separates the weak from the strong. The kind of problem that decides who belongs here and who does not. His words echoed like thunder in the room. Then, without even pretending to choose at random, he looked directly at Sundar. Step forward. The hall fell silent. Sundar rose slowly, his body calm, though his stomach twisted with unease. He walked to the front, feeling the countless eyes upon him. Beside him, Professor Henry picked up a piece of chalk and began writing an enormous equation across the board. The symbols stretched from one end to the other, complex layers that seemed impossible to untangle. When he finished, he stepped back. Solve this, he said. And do it quickly. Hesitation will not be forgiven today. The room buzzed. Whispers flew from seat to seat. Michael, sitting in the back, smirked as he pulled out his notebook, already scribbling. Sundar ignored him. He faced the board, letting the noise fade away until there was nothing but silence in his mind. At first the problem seemed overwhelming, a mountain of symbols designed to confuse. But Sundar reminded himself of everything he had endured, the long nights of study, the countless failures that had taught him patience, the sacrifices his family had made, and the resilience he had built every time someone tried to break him. This was not just a test of knowledge. It was a test of spirit. He began slowly, carefully, breaking the massive problem into smaller pieces. His chalk moved with deliberate precision, each line carrying not just logic, but quiet determination. The room grew silent as students leaned forward, watching. Minutes stretched into long, breathless silences, broken only by the scratch of chalk halfway. Through, he hit a wall. The path he was following collapsed into for a moment, doubt returned. He heard a laugh from the back, Michael's laugh, and the professor's cold voice. You see? This is what happens when persistence meets its limit. But Sundar did not stop. He stepped back, stared at the board, and whispered softly to himself. Then, like a door opening, clarity returned. He erased a section, rewrote it with steady hands, and found a new path. Piece by piece, the chaos of the problem unraveled, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, he circled the final answer. The hall was silent. utterly silent. Everyone could see it was correct. The impossible problem had been solved. Professor Henry's face hardened. He opened his mouth to dismiss it as before, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the room. He's right. Everyone turned. It was Dr. Patel, a visiting scholar and respected mathematician, who had been quietly observing at the back of the room. He stood now, his voice firm. Not only is he right, but the method he used is elegant. It shows not only knowledge, but deep understanding. This young man has done what many advanced students could not. A murmur swept through the crowd. Sundar froze, shocked by the unexpected defense. Professor Henry's lips tightened. This is not about elegance. It is about presence. Doctor. Patel shook his head. No, it is about truth. Mathematics is not a performance. It is the pursuit of understanding. And today, Sundar has shown more strength, more resilience, and more clarity than anyone else in this room. Silence hung heavy, but it was different now. Students shifted uncomfortably, their earlier laughter turning into quiet shame. Even Michael's smug expression faltered, his notebook slipping slightly in his hands. Sundar stood still, his face calm, though his heart pounded. He had not spoken a word in his defense, yet truth had spoken for him. Professor Henry, cornered, gave a stiff nod and turned away, hiding the bitterness in his eyes. The lecture ended without another word. Students left the hall quietly, some glancing at Sundar with newfound respect, others avoiding his gaze altogether. As the room emptied, Michael approached slowly. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something harder to read. He placed the notebook on Sundar's desk. You won today, he said softly, almost grudgingly. But don't think this is over. Sundar looked at the notebook, then at Michael. Instead of anger, he felt something else, pity. He pushed the notebook back. It was never about winning, he said quietly. It was about proving that kindness and patience are not weakness. Michael stared at him for a moment, then turned sharply and walked away. Sundar stood alone in the quiet hall, the weight of weeks lifting slowly from his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would always be more professors, more skeptics, more battles against arrogance and cruelty. But he also knew now, with unshakable certainty, that humility could endure where arrogance collapsed, that resilience, though quiet, was stronger than ridicule, and that respect born of truth was worth more than applause born of fear. As he stepped out of the hall into the fading light, the world felt different. Not softer, not easier, but clearer. The voices of his parents echoed within him, steady and proud. He walked forward, no longer invisible, no longer shaken, but stronger than he had ever been. And somewhere in the silence, though no one else could hear it, a whisper lingered in the air, one that promised his journey had only just begun. Asterisk.